Okay, so we all know that neuraxial anesthesia is the choice for optimal labor anesthesia and as well as for cesarean delivery. And we know this is because it is simple, safe, and it is efficacious also. And all women are young, and we anticipate a very straightforward spine. And we know we have to shoot our spinal at L4-5 and inject the drug and get away with it. But there are some surprises at times because we don't do pre-procedural back examination. And I'll show you what all we can get. Well, sometimes you get beautiful backs also, and you wonder whether I can put in my needle at this point or whether I can put my needle at this point. So there's a confusion regarding this. And if we just see that we think about trapping the tattoo pigment inside the needle, or we are fearful of depositing the pigment into deeper tissues. Sometimes some people may even object that the design has been altered because of our spinal needle. So what do we do at that point of time? There's a small algorithm which says that for a healthy and healed lumbar tattoo on epidural anesthesia area, can you avoid the tattoo? If yes, then please avoid. If no, and you are putting it through the tattoo, it's the usual procedure without nicking the skin. Please don't put a nick and try to take out the tattoo skin. So this is one example, and the other examples are some distorted backs. You do get scoliotic and kyphoscoliotic apart from the usual lumbar lordotic back, and they pose a unique challenge to the anesthesiologist. The incidence is fairly high. I was surprised to see that it is about 40% in obstetric patients, the incidence of unique backs. And through this, we are going to see what we will plan. Whether neuraxial procedure can harm these patients, whether they will be effective, whether the epidural space is scarred or obliterated, but intrathecal space is accessible. So we are going to run through the slides to see how our panelists help us out in this, because life is better when you are aligned. So I opened the panel on neuraxial blocks in a parturient with pathological back. And for this, I'm your moderator, Dr. Kajal. And I invite my very dear friend, Bala Venkat from Coimbatore Ganga Hospital. I think Bala does not need any introduction, but I will fail my duties if I do not inform you that Bala holds very important position and is a proud pride to us on the global front. He is a WFSA representative on a very high chair. He is Asian Oceanic resident and he is Aura Chief Executive also. Besides, he is alumni of PGI Chandigarh, from where I'm hosting this panel. Welcome, Bala.
Thank you so much, Kajal. Pleasure to be in this panel. I look forward to learning from all the learned panelists.
Great. And this, on my right hand of the screen is Dr. Nidhi Bhatia. She is my colleague. She comes from PGI Chandigarh. Nidhi is very keen. She has a keen interest in obstetric anesthesia. She is an AOA participant all these years, and she will also give her expert input on this panel.
Thank you, ma'am. A very good evening to all.
So next I'm inviting Priyam Saikia. Priyam Saikia is hidden in this crowd. This picture I'm showing you is from Guwahati AOA CME, which happened, I think, a couple of years back before COVID pandemic came. And Daisy is moderating this session with us right here, and I'm sitting here. So Priyam is also very closely associated with obstetrics, and he is going to give his expert advice. And then we have a young face, Sunidha Reddy from Rainbow Hospital, Hyderabad. She has also a keen interest in obstetrics and pediatrics, and I'm very happy to have on board these extremely intelligent panelists who are going to give a lot of insight on how to deal with backs, women with backs. So basically, they will tell you whether you should site the epidural. If you site, is it going to work properly, or will it worsen the problem and put you in a medico-legal bridge? Sorry. So I'll run down a few cases. The first case we get is a case of degenerative spine disease. Well, again, I would like to say here, the incidence of degenerative spine disease is very high. And we frequently see women who report to us with disc herniations, facet arthropathy, spondylolisthesis, and then interarticular stress fractures or degeneration. So these women will always come to you with a low back pain, with or without pelvic pain. And I'll bring you a case after this. So say you are confronted with a 31 years old lady, gravida 2, with previous cesarean delivery, who presents at 37 weeks of gestation and is in early labor. When you take her history, she reveals sudden onset of right buttock pain a week back with radiation to right leg. Then you come to know that patient is a known case of lumbar disc disease. So here I will ask my panelists, if you see this MRI image and you see there is a big bulge at L5S1, which does not impinge on S1 nerve roots, what is going to be your plan if patient requests for labor anesthesia? So maybe Bala, we can start with you because you are you're the senior most among us.
Thank you, Kajal. I think this is number one. I would like to thank the scientific committee and Kajal for bringing in such an important topic for the panel discussion. This is of great clinical relevance because very often we see patients with spine problem coming for a neuraxial block. And I think the challenges are, in the opening remarks, I would like to tell, number one, would it be technically difficult to administer the block as an anesthesiologist? Number one question. Number two, whether giving a block will result in further aggravation of the neurological deficit that is present. And number three, is there a long-term consequence of the procedure that you did? Number four, is there a medical legal issue? So with this in mind, the first case scenario is probably the simplest one, which is L5 S1 disc prolapse. And actually, these case scenarios, once I discussed with our spine team, being a spine center, and we do keep discussing before performing a neuraxial block in patients with spine disorder. This is the easiest case, and my take on this is you can safely go ahead and do a labor epidural in this patient or do a neuraxial block in this patient without producing any further deterioration. And fortunately, even if you consider the disc herniation is at L5S1 level, majority of the times you would go and do your neuraxial technique in L3-4 or L4-5. And so even you go by the level, it's not a problem. But even suppose the same case had a disc herniation in L3-4 level, would I still go ahead and give a block? Yes, answer is yes, because there is no contraindication of doing a neuraxial technique in a disc prolapse. However, we will mention in the case sheet under consent for doing the procedure because the patient had symptoms of radiating pain. And only we need to assure to them that this will not further aggravate by the procedure that we do. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bala. But there's a small thing in my mind. What if the woman complains of symptoms which are of recent onset? Say, we all know during pregnancy there is laxity of ligaments, and sometimes the pain is increased during the last trimester of pregnancy. And you have a woman who has now come to you with a new onset of tingling and numbness with some amount of neurological deficit too. What would be your advice to our residents?
No, actually, as I said, we will document both the symptom and the sign, but both of them do not preclude us from using a neuraxial block in this particular case, because your procedure is not going to enhance or further deteriorate the existing neurology. In fact, I feel she may become completely relieved of the discomfort because of the local anesthetic infusion that you're giving. Maybe it's kind of a therapy as well in this particular case. I would still go ahead with the neuraxial block.
Absolutely correct. But in case that's right, the case which I projected, because it's absolutely clear that we can go ahead. But in case, Yeah. So I have taken this master plan from the latest article, as Bala has very rightly said that if there are no symptoms, then there is no additional workup needed. You can go ahead with your spinal plan. But if there are some new onset concerning symptoms, as he's already said, he consulted his spine surgeon. I think an expert neurological or neurosurgical consult can be taken at that point of time. Is that what Bala we were highlighting to when you said so?
Yeah, yeah. No, in a nutshell, for all the delegates, a disc protrusion is not a contraindication for a neuraxial block. That's the take-home message.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. So any other panelists who wants to add on, or we can move ahead to the next case?
Ma'am, I just wanted to not add on, just emphasize what sir has said. Like this is not a contraindication per se, but what is important is documentation, which our residents generally miss. So it is important to take a proper consent and document whatever problem the patient has initially prior to going ahead with the procedure. So like sir said, the procedure per se is not a contraindication. Yes, the documentation should be there of whatever deficits or problem the patient has prior to putting in a block.
Yeah, Bala, one more small thing I would like to ask. Since these women have to undergo labor and delivery, they would be on lithotomy and they'll assume different positions during the delivery of the baby. Do you have a word of caution there to, if a patient has a herniated disc, we should be any word of caution there?
See, as it was one of the things which we normally have in the lithotomy procedure is a possible stretching of the sciatic nerve. Again, the root value of what we see here, L5S1, and then the sacral plexus will be should not be implicated for a more peripheral neuropraxia. So I think that is one thing which we possibly need to keep in mind when we deal with these patients. And that's the reason why the person who advocates the neuraxial block, as Dr. Nidhi said, has to document the existing symptom and the sign and then go ahead and do it. But there is a lot of concern. The minute somebody has got a disc, many anesthesiologists are very concerned in doing a neuraxial block. So I think the take-home message of this particular case is, per se, a disc prolapse with the symptom is not a contraindication, or in other words, a neuraxial block will not worsen the neurology of the patient with this disorder.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bala. We move on for the second case with you. And in this, I would like to say that I would like to ask that you can see there's a very curved spine over here, and clearly we can say that this is a scoliotic spine. So I wish to ask Dr. Priyam Saikya, is this a common thing in young women? Is seeing a scoliotic spine a very common thing?
Yeah, not very common, but not very uncommon also. We have seen quite a few cases of scoliotic spine, and that too very bad spine.
Yes, roughly the incidence is 2%. So yes, it is common, but not so common, uncommon also. So it's basically we all know how to calculate the Cobb's angle, and that determines the severity of scoliosis. So I have another case for you. Kamla, this is a fictional name, is 4 feet 5 inches tall. She has severe kyphoscoliosis affecting both thoracic and lumbar spine. On the anterior posterior view of her X-rays, her scoliosis measured 120 degrees with extreme winging of her scapula. On lateral projection, her kyphotic bend measures approximately 90 degrees. Her iliac crests were adjacent to her lower ribs, and no intervertebral spaces could be palpated in her lumbar spine. So she is for elective section for cephalopelvic dislocation, which is normally the case. So Priyam, what will be your take on that?
Ma'am, can I have the X-ray again? Or
those are just images to tell. Otherwise,
okay. Okay. Not from the patient.
Basically, we are just discussing the implications of a scoliotic spine for a pregnancy. These are all fictitious cases.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay, so it is not the spine which is important important here, we have to consider why this patient developed this kyphoscoliosis.
No, we
Many
have to
cases.
consider whether we can give her a spinal or
Okay,
epidural
right.
if she comes.
Okay.
They have written she is for elective C-section. Would you do
Okay,
a spinal
right.
on her back?
Yeah, we can still try and neuraxial blockade. Around 10 years ago, I was also of the opinion that it would be a very difficult, but we have had quite a few cases where it turned out not to be as difficult as we thought. It might have required a few more punctures than normally we need. And even literature says that patients, whether with a corrected scoliosis or an uncorrected scoliosis, it may not be as high as, I mean, it may not be as difficult as that we have thought about.
Okay, you say that we can give spinal. Are
Yeah.
there any, apprehensions when we do the spinal, or is it like a clean cut, like I showed the first slide? So
No,
what
no,
are the problems we can have?
yeah, because we have seen that the spine is, distorted. So the, the spaces will also be distorted. So, when giving spinal, it is not like a simple straight cut forward spinal. We have to angulate our needle a little bit towards the band. Suppose if it's a lumbar spine, towards the convexity, we will have to go. I mean, we will have to direct our needle towards the convexity. Otherwise, we will be missing the subarachnoid space, or even if we are aiming for an epidural, we will have to go a little bit towards the convex side, because the epidural space is a little bit more widened and positioned towards the convex side.
Are there any reports to suggest that the neuraxial like spinal would be patchy?
Yes, spinal can be patchy, epidural can be patchy. So if we consider the success rate of placement of the block, it may be similar, but the chances of patchy block is a little bit more compared to general population.
So Priya, what happens is that when we take these difficult backs, it often happens that we, during an elective section, we are also relaxed and we take
Yes.
many tricks to, reach the space. And our
Yes.
obstetricians, they become very restless because we are taking so many tricks. So is there any way we can, troubleshoot this? Can our needle trajectory be, better guided?
Yeah, yes, we can use ultrasound if we are conversant with it, because that will show us the midline.
Yes. So there are many case reports now which which tell us that if you use ultrasound for difficult backs, you may be able to identify the limited interspaces in select pathologies. In other like obese spines and all, they may even help you to identify midline. Do you agree with me, Nidhi and Sunidha? I didn't see her on the screen.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so you agree? Have you used this facility?
Yeah, we
Ultrasonography for
we
spine?
do have ultrasound sonocyte in our institute, and we regularly use it for a difficult spine. And especially in such a case, we have to use this pre-operatively in order to know exactly at which space we need to enter, and at the same time at what angle the needle has to be placed. And usually in scoliosis, the vertebral bodies and the spinous processes are a bit rotated, so we need to know exactly at what angle you need to approach the subarachnoid space.
Yeah, Bala, being the chief of regional academy, do you think we should go blind or we should use regional with ultrasound in scoliotic spine?
Kajal, I have few points to mention. Number one, scoliosis is divided into congenital and idiopathic. So that becomes the first important thing as an anesthetist. Majority of the scoliosis is idiopathic. So idiopathic scoliosis are the ones which are present commonly in antenatal cases, because 85% are idiopathic. Why I'm emphasizing this point is the congenital scoliosis are usually associated with other anomalies. So in the anesthetic evaluation, you need to evaluate that one. That's step number one. Number two, the idiopathic scoliosis, majority of the time, it is thoracic with minimal lumbar involvement. Unlike degenerative scoliosis in the old people, where it is predominantly lumbar scoliosis. So we will be fortunate enough in an obstetric patient to have a reasonably good lumbar spine, especially the lower ones. L34, L45 will be, if you take idiopathic scoliosis, majority of them will have their lower lumbar spines normal. That's the second point which I wanted to emphasize. The third point which I wanted to emphasize is, even in a scoliosis which is involving the lumbar level, I would like to give a tip. Go for L4, L5, this interspace, or L5S1 interspace. 100% you will get the neuraxial block without an ultrasound machine. The fourth point which I wanted to mention is, because the scoliosis does not involve L4-5 and L5S1 all the time. So this is for the delegates who don't have an ultrasound, do not feel that it's going to be a challenge. Then the last point which I would want to mention is, majority of the idiopathic scoliosis is a lateral curvature of the spine without a rotation of the vertebral bodies. But the case that you projected shows that there is a possible rotation of the vertebral body. With this, even with an ultrasound, it's very difficult until you are extremely qualified. You can actually see the posterior complex very well, and you can mark it in the preoperative period if the spine is normal. But when the vertebral body is rotated, and when you want to do an ultrasound, it is definitely a challenge, and it needs an expertise to do it. And two ways of doing it. One is, in the preoperative period, you do a scanning, screen it, locate the place where you're going inside. And the other one is to do online. You need two people, you scrub up, one person is showing you, the other person is pushing in the needle, it's live. So in very complex situations, it's very difficult to locate it in the preoperative period, and then you try and go and do it. Whenever the vertebral body is rotated, it's best to do it live, the procedure is done with the scanning on. So these are a few points which I want to say. There is not going to be much difference in spread of the drug in the epidural or spinal, because we need to understand that this is a circumferential space. When the scoliosis happens, there is a curvature on one side, the epidural space may be minimized there, but the opposite side, it's much more open. So it's a circular space, and so the spread of the drug is usually not a problem. This is what we have noticed. But in this particular patient, one additional point I want to mention is, she's very, very short. So the whatever volume that you inject has to be really guarded, whether it's a neuraxial, whether it's spinal or epidural. So these are a few points which I wanted to say regarding this case.
Bala, you have really summarized it well. You told the major population of attendees that do not need to worry if you don't have an ultrasound, because L4-5 and L5S1 are relatively spared, and that's the point where you can select to put your spinal needle. And if you have an ultrasound, do have a learning curve. Try to do it in normal spines. We have evidence now with us, which is suggesting that use ultrasonography in the preoperative room to mark your spaces, and then know how to rotate and tilt your probe. Anything you would like to add, maybe because you are also using ultrasound in your clinical practice daily?
Yes, ma'am. In these cases, ultrasound can come in really very handy. You have to do a pre-scan, and but obviously, if there is a lot of rotation, and if it's the Cobb's angle is too much, if it's a severe scoliosis, then it becomes difficult. And again, doing a real-time ultrasound is a little difficult, and so that is why we commonly do a pre-scan to locate our midline, or where we can enter, and at how much depth. So real-time is a little difficult in such cases, and the difficulty increases if there is a rotation of the vertebra.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. I think we'll move on to the case with Tech 3. And having talked about scoliosis, sometimes we will also receive these women who have got this scoliosis corrected, and they have an instrumented spine. You know that there's a posterior fusion mostly done for this, and it is called a Harrington rod fixation. So Nidhi, if you see a spine like this, say if a 23 years old young lady, as Bala has already said, some patients would be having a congenital scoliosis. She presents to you at 36 weeks of gestation, and she had undergone Harrington rod placement with eyelid bone grafting for idiopathic scoliosis. Her pre-operative evaluation shows that she's 165 centimeters, 85 kg with women with a normal airway. Her only symptom is occasional back pain during her pregnancy. She could not recall the extent of her spinal fusion and her old x-rays were not available. However, she had a midline scar which extends down to the level of L5 and over her left eyelid crest. So, can you give neuraxial anesthesia? And if you do so, what challenges are you likely to face? Then again, can the block be patchy? And can you face medical legal implications? And how would you ask for consent?
So this is one of a very challenging back to give a neuraxial. Though neuraxial is not contraindicated, you can give a neuraxial anesthesia, but you should be aware of the challenges that you are about to actually face. So there are a number of difficulties which you may encounter. So one could be a difficulty in positioning the patient because of the implant per se, and because most of these patients, they also undergo spinal fusion. So because of that, you may have difficulty in positioning the patient. Secondly, most of these patients, like this case also, she has a complaint of chronic back pain. So many of these patients actually have chronic back pain, and that pain additionally, makes achieving a proper position a little difficult. And then thirdly, there may be an underlying uncorrected progressive secondary scoliosis, which again makes it difficult. And then it is important to know the type of surgery and the extent of surgery that has taken place. Because like in this case, an iliac bone graft was placed. So when grafting and spinal fusion is done, most of the times the spinous process is removed and there is the lamina are decorticated. So in that case, all your tactile landmarks, the landmarks which you palpate at the time of giving a subarachnoid block or a neuraxial block, that is your spinous process and all, they are obliterated. So you may not be able to feel them. Then another thing is you need to know what type of procedure, how it has been done. Like in certain cases when the Harrington rods are placed, nowadays, mostly the surgeons, they place the implants a bit laterally and pedicle screws are placed. But there may be procedures in which, when a pedicle screw is placed, generally your spinal canal is kind of not obliterated. But when you have Harrington rod hooks, these hooks, they generally pass through your ligamentum flavum and go and attach to the lamina. And in that case, your ligamentum flavum may again get obliterated, and so the traditional loss of resistance you may not feel when you're putting in the needle. Then per se, the intrathecal space in most of these cases is fine. So when you're giving a subarachnoid block, that the spread of the drug and all is not a problem. What literature says is a lot of problem is there when you're placing epidurals because of the epidural scarring. So there may be a patchy effect. You're placing a catheter may be difficult in such cases. So all these problems you should be aware. So per se, you need to know the extent of surgery. Like in this case, our previous records were not there and there is no radiology. So we do not know. We only know that the scar extends to a particular level. So generally till the place where your spinal fusion or Harrington rods are placed a little below that, your scar extends. So that can give you a little idea up to what level the surgery has been done. Plus, if you are well versed with ultrasound, that can again come in handy here. It will tell you the level. With the ultrasound, you can also identify the rod. It appears like a hyperechoic structure. So you can see that also, and it will tell you the level. Then again, like sir mentioned in the last case, most of these cases, the L5S1 is generally not involved. So that is another area where you can put in your needle easily. So, but having said that, before you take up such cases, you should be aware that you will find these difficulties while giving this block. And so a proper consent should be taken from the patient. You need to explain to her that there may be a failed block or there may be a patchy block. And plus there may be a difficulty and the duration of placing a block may be a bit longer because of a difficult spine. So all this consent has to be taken, but a neuraxial anesthesia can be given.
Okay, Mudhi, that's very elaborate, and there were one or two points that I picked up from your answer. Maybe you can ask Lala. Lala, these days, this is a very major surgery. Sometimes we have lumbar disc, removed. We used to call it lumbar discectomy. And nowadays they do some microdiscectomy. So do they give both the surgeries? Do they give similar feel when you do an epidural? Because in one you are just trying to make a hole, and in the other you are trying to destroy the ligamentum flavum. So are you like? Do you want to give a word of caution there to our attendees?
So actually, I just want few points in this. Before we embark on doing a neuraxial block in a patient who has undergone a previous spine surgery, number one, we need to know whether it's instrumented or not. Number two, we need to know if it is instrumented, what kind of instrumentation was given. This is very important because what is that we wanted to do? We wanted to find the interlaminar space to enter inside the neuraxial region. So it becomes important either to discuss with the surgeon or to see the postoperative or the discharge summary to see what kind of implants are put, or if feasible, if we think neuraxial is going to be very helpful, we can subject them to a radiological investigation if we think it's mandatory to get to know what kind of instrument it is. The reason is, if it is posterior instrumentation with a midline incision with bone grafting, it's very difficult to access those spaces. We can never enter. However, if it is, if now you see there is a procedure called TLIF, where they enter much more laterally and the interlaminar space is preserved. So, and also we need to know sometimes the instrumentation is on one side and not on both the sides. So if the left side is instrumented, the right side is free. So it's important that we just cannot make a dogmatic statement based upon a spine surgery or an instrumentation and say neuraxial is difficult. We need to go into the intricate details to see if this can happen. Regarding the epidural space, as it was mentioned by Dr. Nidhi, is kind of obliterated by fibrous tissue whenever an instrumentation is done at that particular level, and it's completely obliterated. So if you see, always it's a good idea still, if you want to go to a neuraxial block, to go 2 space above or 2 space below the fusion and still go ahead and give a spinal. And epidural spread may be difficult, but intrathecal can be given for a C-section. So these are few points which I wanted to tell about the instrumentation. And regarding the incision site, normally it is 1.5 to 2 inches in 2 segments more than the instrumentation. When you see the surgeon opening up, skin is the longest, followed by the soft tissue and then the osteotome. So the osteotomal and the dermatomal relationship is not the same. So the dermatomal, the incision is much lower than the instrumented level. So just because of the scar, we needn't think that the instrument is extending to that region. So many times I have gone into the scar to give the neuraxial block. And majority of the time you feel that it's much more easier than what you actually think. But one of the things which you need to keep in mind when you have a scar tissue there is difficult to go with 27 gauge or a 26 gauge needle. Preferentially, you go for a needle like 23 or 25 needle because it becomes easy to negotiate the fibrous tissue.
So my audience is going to ask you, can I put the 23 gauge in the past in land up to this? What would be your advice for that?
Yeah, your audio was not clear, Kajal.
Okay. I said if we give a 23 gauge, my audience may ask you, what about the risk of PDPH?
Yeah, see, actually, anesthesia is full of balancing act. If you think that neuraxial block is going to save the patient from the concerns of general anesthesia, then you need to take a particular stand that the pro and con of which is better for the patient in the overall outcome. And here I would like to mention that if you're using a 23 or a 25 gauge needle, when we think the incidence of PDPH is high, you're going to recommend to the patient all the things that they need to do to decrease the incidence. And if at all the initial symptom starts, and I really want to tell you, we found that the sphenopalatine ganglion block extremely helpful. The lignocaine pledgets placed in both the nostrils for 20 minutes, 3 times a day for 3 days takes away the PDPH that you produced. So it's a balancing act.
Sumitra, if this patient comes for emergency section and we can give Nurexil block, would you still go ahead with it, or you would like to change your plan?
No, I would like to go ahead.
Scenarios, we have all got a lot of advice for that. So if the same patient lands up in an emergency section.
So the emergency, again, I would like to ask which category of emergency section it is. If it is not a category A where I have to go ahead immediately and deliver, then I would take my time, scan the spine, as sir and ma'am have previously explained about how to go ahead. I would go ahead with a spinal anesthesia.
Great. So,
Kajal, it's very heartening to see everybody is a regional anesthetist here.
you have given so many workshops and conferences, you have convinced finally. So, to conclude this case, the case reports series and some prospective MAT case control studies have shown us that successful spinal and epidural anesthetics can be achieved, but may be more technically challenging. And for these technical challenges, you have heard the mentors speak a lot about tips and tricks to troubleshoot. So we go on to the next case witness. And here I present to you another scenario, again an implanted thing. So this is a 35 years Gravida 2 Para 1 past student at 32 weeks of gestation, who reports with an implanted spinal cord stimulator and comes for an urgent cesarean section. It happens at 32 weeks also. Don't take me into the obstetric side of it. I just want to show you an implanted spinal cord stimulator. And since our panelists were telling us that the space is free and you can go lower down, and now let us see, maybe they come up and tell us how to go about this case. So basically, the spinal cord stimulators for the novice audience, they are indicated in complex regional pain syndromes, sometimes in post-laminectomy syndromes and peripheral painful peripheral neuropathies. And they include electrical leads and extensions, pulse generators, and sometimes the battery is, inserted in the subcutaneous, which is just like a pacemaker. So we need to understand a little more about them. Let's see what our panelists have to say regarding the concerns for spinal anesthesia in such backs. So, can we start with you? Would you like to take on?
Yeah, ma'am, I have not come across a real patient with the SCD. So whatever I know is from literature. I have not seen a single patient.
Okay.
What I feel is that there must be a reason why this spinal cord stimulator was placed. So we need to understand the implication of that reason. And number second point is that it will have some electrodes, most of the time placed in maybe in thoracic level, depending on the origin of the pain. And then some electrodes which will be coming through the subcutaneous tissue into the pulse generator. So we will have to see where those electrodes are placed, and we will have to see the course of the, that lead, and whether it comes in our way of providing Nurexil anesthesia.
So again, there is a need to emphasize on a pre-anesthetic evaluation and not to take obstetric backs as a simple back. And basically, as you have highlighted, there are things safe as long they do not interfere with the as long as there is no mechanical interference with the device. So basically, I will not dwell on that more because I've got a very interesting case lined up. Case witness 5. Sometimes when we examine the backs, we see these kind of spinal dysraphisms, like they could be spina bifida occulta, or they could be a cystica, or they could be a meningomyelocele, and so on and so forth. So basically, these are a group of congenital malformations involving the vertebral arches, cord, and the meninges. And they are most common birth defects with an incidence which is very high, with isolated bone abnormalities. The most common is occulta. So there is a risk stratification to this also. And maybe Bala, since it's a very complex lesion, you can tell us if a woman who's Gravida 1 history of surgery for spina bifida and a feeder cord, who also gives history of a lipomeningocele operated at 3 months of age. At the age of 10, she developed a feeder cord syndrome, which required surgery. Unfortunately, due to progressive neurological symptoms, she required a second unfeathering procedure. Her neurological impairments currently included weakness in legs, distal more than proximal, distal lower extremely numbness, and urinary incontinence. She also requires braces and crutches to walk and needs to self-catheterize, thereby implying that she has a neurological deficit. Her MRI shows cord dysraphism from L4 to L5 with a lipomeningocele. And there are surgical changes at L3 to 5. Neural elements were present in the sacrum. So she presents at 39 weeks in labor now.
The case is complex, but the answer is simple. I would just go for a general anesthesia. Anything related to neural tissues, I'm scared to touch. All the things which we discussed earlier was related to the bone and its relationship to the epidural space and our ability to reach there. But the minute there is a neural involvement, I have never touched a patient for a neuraxial block with a previous history of tethered cord or anything to do with this, because the whole region is complex and the neural structures can present in different form. And I would definitely not venture into giving a neuraxial block in this case. However good I'm regional anesthetist, I am. So my answer is simple. I will definitely not go for a neuraxial block in this case or any case with the spinal cord getting involved. I don't want to produce more damage to the patient.
So this is a word of caution, and when people leave from here, they should not feel that all the cases are simple and it's just a matter of one needle. You can put it anywhere, because our expert panelists they have advised us for it. Definitely, there's a word of caution here. Anybody who begs to differ, Sunitra, Antiam, and Nidhi, do you want to add in?
I totally agree with Dr. Bala sir. Anywhere there is an exposure of neural tissues, there is a very high chance of cauda equina or a neural deficit, which can get exacerbated, or new development of neurological deficit can happen if you go and manipulate with a neuraxial anesthesia. So best done would be under general anesthesia.
Ma'am, I think the diagnosis that was mentioned was occulta, right?
But she had a feathered cord because she
so those things are very confusing. It should not have been and occulta. Maybe for if I have got a recent imaging study where the neural tissue was not involved, because it is not that spinal dysraphism will involve neural tissue. It may not involve neural tissue. So in those selected cases, maybe, because sir has already said that even I will not touch a patient who has got involvement of neural tissue.
So you would like to go image guided. If it's an occult or it's a closed thing, maybe you would like to select a
yes, maybe if it is available to us, if images are available to us.
So any point of difference here by the panelists?
No, actually, Kajal, I think only thing which is very important is whatever we are discussing should be applicable to every participant, every part of the world, which is the right thing to do. Or in other words, what he does should not result in much more disadvantage or neurodeficit to the patient. So if GA is not a contraindication, we needn't even get into all this finding the neural tissue. If there was no way out, then it's fine. But otherwise, I think simple answer is to go for GA. That would be the take-home message.
Absolutely. We have this reference article, and we must understand here that based on we do not have any trials to or evidence-based consensus guidelines which give us an insight. These are just case reports. And even the guidelines also mention case reports only. So as all the panelists are opining that open lesions, evidence of lumbosacral neurological deficits, they require additional investigations. Better to go ahead without injecting anything into their spine. So this is a very important case. Another important, other interesting case. Sometimes we do understand there are some perineural cysts. So perineural cysts, they're also called Tarlov cysts, and they are pathological dilations of the meninges formed in between the peri and the endoneurium, and they occur along the spinal nerves at the dorsal root ganglion. So if you have a woman who presents, a young lady who presents with a history, 2-year history of intermittent back pain and lower limb paresthesia, secondary to a S1 segment perineural cyst or maybe a higher cyst, what are the implications of doing spinal anesthesia in the context of perineural cysts? And can anybody tell me, since the cysts are CSF filled and you happen to, do your spinal and you feel the CSF trickles down, but you don't have a block, is this the reason for the failed spinal? Nidhi, you want to take it up or should I pass it on?
Yeah,
And
it
Bala
is.
will take your view because you are going to fix the answer at the end.
Yeah, this could be one reason of a failed spinal, like to puncture the cyst and deposit the drug there. So again, in these cases, you have to see the patient as a whole, at which level the cyst is present. Commonly, these are in the sacral region, and whether they are symptomatic or no, how much neurological symptoms they are causing. So if they are in the region of where you want to give your block and they are causing neurological symptoms, I would not venture into giving a regional in such cases. But because one is they can aggravate the neurological damage. Second is there are increased chances of failed spinal. If you happen to go and you can happen and go and puncture the cyst. So all these problems are there. So you have to see, take a decision depending upon the position or place of the cyst and how much symptoms it is causing, the symptoms caused by the cyst.
Okay, let's see what Bala has to tell us, and then we'll go on to the last case because the time is running out and there's no very extensive.
These cysts are more common than we think. If you are in referral centers, you see them very common. And is there a contraindication to do it? No. As Dr. Nidhi said, see where it is present, and if you could avoid that space, go ahead and do it. But as rightly said, if you have not done the imaging, and you just do not know the cyst is existing, in most of the cases it's like that, then this is a reason for failed spinal, because you think that is CSF and you inject the drug and it's a complete failure. So these are the two messages I would like to give. Thanks.
Okay, the next case, I will take everybody's involvement because this is a very common scenario. This is case witness 6, and this is a trauma victim who is in collar. And sometimes we do see them in pregnancy. In my own institute, we have seen quite a few cases of cervical cord trauma, especially the cervical cord. Where here I've put an image where you are seeing there's a cervical cord damage. She was a pregnant lady. We all must remember that pregnant women, they lose their center of gravity towards the end of their trimesters and they do tend to fall. And if they are belonging to a low socioeconomic status where they keep on carrying on doing their work, they are at this occupational hazard. So I bring to you one case which we faced in our own institute. A 35-year-old female at 36 weeks of gestation was brought to our hospital with history of fall of bricks from the roof of the house on patient's nape of neck at 6 p.m. an evening before. She presented next morning at 8 a.m. with sudden onset quadriplegia with complete loss of sensations below C5 level. Tenderness was present over cervical region and cervical collar was applied. CT scan showed C5, C6 laminar fracture with anterolisthesis. Now, there was a consensus between the neurosurgeon and the obstetrician, and in view of impending respiratory compromise, the decision was made to do a cesarean section for both maternal and fetal well-being. At this point of time, I asked my esteemed panelists, can we give Nurexil analgesia to a patient who has got cervical cord injury with quadriplegia without respiratory compromise?
Kajal, thanks for bringing up this case. But one of the first thing I would wanted to mention is majority of these fractures will possibly be in a state of shock, which can happen because of sudden sympathectomy, and your neuraxial block might further aggravate the hypotension, number one. And many of them are also having bradycardia. So this again has to be kept on mind, because many of our cervical spine fractures, we put them on Allopent to make sure that the heart rate doesn't go down. So the number three is positioning this patient to give a spinal. It's a huge challenge that you may produce a secondary spinal cord injury because if that picture was true, it's a it could be an unstable fracture. And making the patient lateral itself is going to add another challenge in positioning. And number four, you said it's C5 level. Anything here you need, and this needs a fixation for this patient. He needs a cervical spine
So,
fracture.
Balamir, I want you to divide it into three sections. One is this, what you are talking, an extremely unstable fracture with hemodynamic compromise and the possibility of spinal shock. That is a class apart. There is one patient, don't remember that scan which I showed you. Say if a patient has,
The problem is, no, Kajal, cervical spine, we can't take it like this. What was a stable fracture, you will make it unstable by positioning for spinal.
So your take is don't do regional.
I think considering the other factors, the practical factors involved, I would prefer to go in for a general anesthetic for this patient, and also I would go in for, with the consent of the patient attendants, the minute the child is delivered, to go for a cervical spine fixation.
Correct. So I really agree with you that such patients should not be like, we have out of the entire scenarios. There are two scenarios where the panelists feel we should not try to venture with neuraxial anesthesia. Any panelist who differs? Any panelists? So I think the audience, the message is loud and clear to the audience that do go in for your general anesthesia, protect the patient's airway, do it in a controlled fashion rather than landing up in a trouble. So we will quickly go through some neuromuscular diseases, although they do not form pathological backs as such, but they do give us some trouble. So like there are certain cases of myasthenia gravis, multiple sclerosis. So do you have any take on that, Sunita? Can you tell us if a patient is a sufferer of multiple sclerosis, which affects about 80 to 90% of patients, and with a relapsing limiting kind of a scene? So do you think we should go ahead, will anesthetic be falsely implicated in relapse if it happens?
Any stress, any kind of manipulation with the spine probably may deteriorate the multiple sclerosis further. And at the same time, general anesthesia drugs such as succinylcholine or rocuronium or vecuronium, these all can push the patient into a further deterioration. So it has to be a balanced act. Documentation of the deficits preoperatively have to be done. Consent has to be elaborately taken, and also explain that the neurological deficits what the patient is having can get deteriorated. So keeping all this in mind, we have to go ahead for surgery.
So this is correct that you have to individualize the cases, and you have to final anesthesia for multiple sclerosis have been there are case reports and case series. So there is increased risk of relapse irrespective of the anesthetic use. He has rightly said that we should explain it. Anybody we have in the audience who would like to add on? And same goes for myasthenia gravis, in which there are muscle weaknesses and there is inability to push. There is a risk of aspiration. In such cases, what is the take? Dr. PM, would you like to tell the audience?
For myasthenia gravis, the patients will be on multiple medications. So that has to be kept in mind so that the patients do not skip those medications. Otherwise, a myasthenia gravis crisis can be precipitated. we had patients with myasthenia gravis who had come for cesarean section, and if it is not contraindicated, we have been using new legal anesthesia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since we are running short of time, I would like to just summarize this wonderful panel by saying that all our panelists are advising to weigh the risks and benefits of neonatal anesthesia. We should have a pragmatic approach that highlights whether there is a physical obstruction to the needle, catheter or the catheter trajectory, or a distant spinal or intracranial lesion that could contribute to morbidity. If neorectal anesthesia or anesthesia are deemed to have an excessive risk, or if the patient wants to avoid neorectal intervention, or other forms of labor pain management like intravenous anesthesia or general anesthesia should be given as a viable option. And if there is any more, we have Dr. Sunil, our president, in the audience. We have Ravindra, and then we have Daisy, who have been deliberating on this in various other conferences. If they would like to give their final word, they can just give the final word to the audience, and then we will close the panel by thanking all the panelists for preparing and going through their cases and their personal experiences in this matter. So Daisy, would you like to add something? You're muted.
Yeah, it was an excellent panel discussion. Like ma'am, we have 2-3 cases of severe kyphoscoliosis in last year. So what I have found is that in emergency situation, when we have ultrasound, we find it more difficult in emergency situation. Like paramedian approach also, I find it quite easy than rather than finding the midline also. And routinely, like nerve conduction test also, if you're elective section and all, then we can always go for medical legal region. You can ask for a nerve conduction test, I guess so.
Thank you. Sunil, would you like to give a closing remark?
Kajal, I think you have done an excellent job, and Bala, Priyam, Sunidara, Nidhi, and Daisy and Ravindra. Yes, it was a very, very meaningful discussion. As Bala put it rightly, primum non nocere. First of all, do no harm. So whenever there is a neurological damage already existing, and if GA is not an issue, go for GA. GA is not bad. You need to remember that. But yes, in every case with spinal pathology, you have to weigh risk versus benefit, and whatever, if the benefit outweighs the risk, then you can go whatever technique is feasible. But yes, regional has its own place, own charm, and just a mere spinal pathology is not a contraindication for regional, is what I would like to say.
Thank you very much. I thank all the panelists, Bala Venkat and Priyam, Nidhi and Sunidra. Thank you so much for pitching in for this wonderful and meaningful panel. I
Thank you,
hand
ma'am.
it over to now the moderators.
Thank you.